Timothy Chalamet,
帅
Hijitora Matcha,
帅
Land to Sea Pineapple Buns.
帅
Let's circle back to that.
帅
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Let's Circle Back. We are your hosts. I'm Valentina.
And I'm Timothy Chalamet. Just kidding, I'm Hebe.
We are looking forward to talking about today's topic, as we always are, because this is something that we do currently go through or have experience with to a certain extent.
And that is how to hang out with friends during the weekends without breaking the bank.
Wow. I personally need tips on that because tell me why it's minimum $20 to hang with friends while sitting down somewhere. But before we get into that, as a reminder, this podcast is not corporate affiliated and all opinions are our own. So let's get into it. Not first, not second, but third spaces. What's the deal with that? The American sociologist Ray Oldenburg defines a third place as a place outside of the home and the workplace where people go to converse with others and connect with their community. If you think back to your childhood, third spaces are kind of built in or available by default. We can extend childhood to include college, I think, if you think about it. There's a lot of shared common spaces, there are libraries, there are open lawns, there might be spaces in your own dormitories where you can hang out with students and have a conversation outside of class, outside of studying, and outside of a job. But go back even further and you might recall malls, bowling alleys, after school clubs. These are all places where you're not required to go because they're not built into your academics or your home life, but they're places where you go to specifically meet up with people and spend time in a social setting.
And then in more recent times, because of social media, the root of all evil, that's what we always talk about on this podcast, we're also seeing a digital shift of what is a third space. So changing its meaning, its traditional meaning. So if you think about early communities on the internet that could be classified as a third space, I think Wattpad should have a whole book to its own. There's the fan fiction community, there's the writing community. I would even argue there's a pretty prominent role-playing community on Wattpad. And then slightly more recent, but it's kind of gone now, but Amino Apps, which is an app specifically dedicated to creating and fostering very niche communities. So how it works is they're almost like clubs that you have to click enter to join, but they range from everything from crafts and arts to people who want to learn languages to people who, I don't know, want to learn math. Personally, never came across one like that, but I'm sure there is one. And then there's Twitter, less organized via structure, but on Twitter you will find various fandoms. Valentina and I were personally part of the Stan Twitter for K-pop, which we've shared before on this podcast of our personal stories of meeting friends and people via Twitter. So I would consider that as a digital third space. And then the classic Tumblr, which honestly pisses me off a little bit because it's so hard to customize your own page, but people spend a lot of hours and dedication on Tumblr, on their blogs, so I think that is a big one. More recently, there's creator-centric digital spaces. So not so much surrounding a specific topic or hobby you're really interested in, but more of a person you enjoy watching and engaging. And I think Twitch, as well as Discord, is a big platform for this particular third space. So think about people who would sit in Kai Cenat's Twitch stream for hours trying to interact and engage with him, or Discord, where I think some creators create Discord channels for their followers that you can join, and sometimes they pop in and say hello, otherwise you chat with other followers. So I think these are really interesting examples and interesting manifestations of digital third space that we're currently seeing.
I would also like to argue that at a certain point in our childhoods, public or shared Minecraft servers were also a third space. Because personally, I would make plans with my friends to join certain servers like Mineplex or Hypixel at the same time, or the Roblox games. We played a lot of Roblox parkour, a lot of Roblox tycoons. Like, it was a thing, and we'd get on call and we'd talk while we played.
This reminds me of this video game called Pixel Gun 3D, which is its artwork is basically like Minecraft. And then I would meet like random people, I'm assuming around my age. I hope they are. But we would make plans to play the game during the weekends or after school in a private server, like all of us together. So I completely agree. I think video game private servers might be one of the earliest manifestations of digital third spaces. I think Animal Crossing made its big name during the pandemic. If you remember, it's ridiculously hard to buy a Switch Lite during that time. And I think it's because Animal Crossing gave that shared space with either yourself, but also with your friends to create almost like a utopia for yourself. Speaking of brands that create active opportunities for people to hang out, I was at a book signing event last night. It was with the former Coach CEO. He mentioned how certain Coach retail locations started opening up coffee shops and how that, compared to shops without, saw an increase in purchase intent. And it might be because people are more inclined to go, hang around, and then along the way decided to pick up $1,000 bag. Food for thought. I thought it was really interesting he mentioned that.
As per the University of Chicago, in the US, it does appear that coffee shops and bars are some of the most common third spaces, but the cost of entry into these places, so buying a pastry or a drink, is increasingly regarded as a slightly annoying barrier. If you want to think about free third spaces, there are things like parks, libraries, and surprisingly, we do still have shopping malls, but they're decreasing in quantity and becoming increasingly inaccessible. There's a lack of sufficient public transport, there are busier schedules the older you get, and unfortunately, higher cost of living for all of us, which are all examples of challenges that are impeding more commonplace use of third spaces.
And just to add some more color to the rapid closing of American third spaces, in a 2020 article on the National Institutes of Health, found that arts or recreational centers, retail hobby stores, even religious institutions are expecting a downward trend as we go into the future. Malls, in particular, are closing down across the nation at very rapid rates. Obviously, there is no one source of truth on what that rate is, but one study did suggest that 25% of US malls may close in the next 3 to 5 years. And another forecast is predicting that by 2028, there's as few as 900 malls remaining, even though it currently stands at 1,200 this year, 2025. And then the American Time Use Survey did show that the average time spent among US adults at home rose between 2002 and 2022 by an hour and 39 minutes, give or take, which makes sense. You have less physical hangout options, which translates to more time at home and likely with self. This should be common sense, but feel like it's very important to reiterate. I'm not claiming causation, but correlates with the rising loneliness that we're seeing in young people. And obviously, then this trend would have a big impact on mental health and physical health. As humans, we generally need that connection and community to flourish. This is where I put my positive psychology class knowledge into use.
And if you want to hear more about loneliness, please listen to our entire podcast episode about it.
Great plug.
But before I transition away, this idea of more time at home has led to more people, especially creators online, romanticizing loneliness or singlehood or their own company. And it's an interesting dichotomy between being happy with your independence, but addressing and fulfilling that human need to spend time with other people. I think it's totally healthy and actually a really positive practice to romanticize spending time alone and being with yourself, but only to a certain extent. At which point, my personal belief is that if we romanticize too much, it's just a coping mechanism because we're all a little bit lonely. Humans need community and need quality relationships. Otherwise, we're all going to go insane.
Period. Mic drop.
Unfortunately, third spaces are not totally accessible to everyone. And this is where we open a very mindful discussion of privilege associated with third spaces. One thing Hebe and I were talking about when we were planning this episode is how we don't think about it, but infrastructure, specifically thinking about public transport, walkability, roads, are all factors in increasing the accessibility of third spaces that, if you live in New York, like we do, you can start to take for granted. Many people don't have the buses, the metros, or even the walking paths to get from one place to another. And if you don't have public transport, then you need a car. And that's an additional cost that, again, not everyone, especially young people who aren't working yet, is going to have disposable income to account for. So the fact that I can leave my apartment and walk down the street to a coffee shop or take the train to meet a friend is inherently a huge privilege because I have the ability to go and meet people. But that's not possible for everyone, and it's another huge contributor to this loneliness crisis.
I think there's a lot to unpack there. And I think a really good example in Philly, which is my town when I was in college and where Valentina sometimes is located at. But if you don't know, Philadelphia, specifically near Chinatown, which is a very iconic landmark in the city, is trying to build a 76ers stadium. During my time there as a student, there has been multiple protests, student organized or community organized, against this decision. Of course, capitalism does not listen. But I like to use that as an example of privilege of third spaces because I think the construction of that stadium is twofold. One, it impacts nearby small businesses. So the stadium being there will literally drive up rent, which may or may not put small business out of business. And that leads to less hangout spots, whether it's cafes or more affordable restaurants that students can go and have fun during the weekends, or even for the residents living there. Two, I feel like there's class implications for the stadium because how regular can an average person afford going to a game every week? Personally, never paid for one, but I can imagine they're very expensive. So it's not accessible to a general public by any means. And then not going on a random tangent here, but this whole conversation about privilege and third space makes me think of this concept of food deserts, which are geographic areas which typically low-income urban neighborhoods or rural towns where they have limited access to affordable and nutritious food, especially when it comes to fresh produce. This is definition directly ripped off of Google. While it's not exactly related to third space, it's showing how, one, there's socioeconomic implications to certain infrastructures, but also how the lack of these infrastructures lead to poor health incomes or mental incomes in a particular population. And I know Valentina has a really cool stat to share, and a little sad, honestly.
Yeah, coincidentally, last night I heard the founder of Share My Meals, which is an NGO that takes food from corporate events or school cafeterias or hospital cafeterias at the end of the day when they're going to throw it out and redistributes it to unhoused populations and food pantries. And she cited a Harvard study that just 30% of the food waste that we have in the United States could feed 42 million Americans, while also, just for the fun of it, lowering greenhouse gas emissions. Which, we haven't talked about this, but I can't believe food waste is directly related to climate change. And there are solutions for all of these things. They're not getting implemented as broadly as they should, which is not all necessarily related to third spaces, but it ties into this discussion of privilege that a lot of people take for granted and has real impact. But to tie it back to third spaces, anecdotally, Hebe and I really love to grab food or a drink or both in a sequence and just talk or catch up. And we always end up going to the Strand. For me, this is probably my favorite way to catch up with friends, even though while I'm hanging out, I know in the back of my head that I'm not enjoying spending $7 to $10 on a beverage, which for those who don't live in New York, that is the average price of anything that isn't a plain coffee in New York. I do try to justify it by thinking it's kind of like paying rent to spend time in a certain establishment, but it's not sustainable if you're doing it 2 to 3 times a week every week. I do miss going to the mall with my friends. It's one of my favorite middle school memories. I used to go to Cary Parkside in Shanghai. Like, this is my place. And even if I'm not buying anything there, just the act of window shopping is also very fulfilling because you're gossiping and you're talking about your families while you're pointing out things in the displays. I think back to acknowledging privilege, one really nice thing about New York City is that if you want to, you can just walk down the street and talk. And if you feel like dishing out the 2.90 for the subway, in theory, you could just get on the subway and ride it one end to another end nonstop while you talk to your friends. Central Park is also like a resource that I don't really take advantage of, even though it's a huge park in the middle of the city, and I'm sure it would be really healthy for me to get out there and physically touch grass after being in the concrete forever. But, there's just things that you don't always think about.
I have also really struggled with finding what third place mean to me. Obviously, you highlighted a lot of the options that people tend to default to during the weekends when they want to catch up with people. So you either go meal grabbing at a restaurant you haven't tried, you sit down at a cafe and have an $8 coffee and maybe a little croissant, or you go to like recreational events that New York has to offer. So Broadway, museums, but all of them kind of cost money, and you can't do that every other day or every weekend and have that be sustainable. So I've gotten pretty creative in how to hang out. Actually, last night is one of my first venture out of the norm. I decided to go to a fireside chat and a book signing event hosted by the Parsons School, free to the public. And I was like, why not? Because I usually don't do things during the weekday after work that doesn't involve eating out. And I thought that was a really nice experience and something I would love to do more. Pop-ups, huge culture of New York. So I think because of lack of affordable third spaces have started to force people to look into alternative, non-traditional ways of meeting up with people, which I thought is really interesting.
If you haven't picked up on it, we discuss community a lot on the podcast. This is definitely not our first time talking about it, and it will not be the last. I think in a future episode, I'd love to talk about the nuances of the word community and how online discourse is really argumentative about selfishness versus selflessness and how you need sacrifice to have a good community. But I'm not going to get into that this time because I would want to give that all the attention it deserves.
Period. I love how each episode we just sign up for another one, to dig a hole for ourselves. But since we're marketers, have to tie this back to what it means for brands, for marketing. In our opinion, brands have the opportunity to foster community among their consumers. I feel like a lot of brands think they have to establish that one-to-one relationship between them and the consumer, but I feel like it should be a web. Obviously, you want to talk to your consumers, but you also want the consumers to talk with each other. Because if you haven't taken an introductory class for psychology, there's a concept called in-group bias, which is the human tendency to favor members of our own group versus outsiders. And I feel like by fostering that community, which is a very overused word on this podcast, you can achieve some level of that effect. Obviously, I feel like in-group bias has a pretty negative connotation to it, but in the context of business, it's pretty profitable.
Yeah, and there are definitely lots of avenues that brands go through for that, but one way to build this that, in my opinion, should be free and incredibly easy is just to encourage people to post your product more from launches that you do or pop-up events that you host by interacting with all of the user-generated content that quote unquote normal people and micro influencers and other types of content creators are just organically creating. The feeling you get when you post something about a brand or a product that you like and they comment on your post or like it or share it to their story is really special. It does feel like such a small thing, but in the moment you're like, oh, they've acknowledged my existence or they've shown appreciation for the fact that I'm engaging with their brand.
Another brand takeaway that is not directly related to third spaces, but connected with our earlier discussion, almost every other episode, which is understanding changing consumer priorities. Valentina put this best, so I'll let her get a chance to share her story, but people are choosing to spend money to hang out with their friends, which you can argue is then their priority, and not so much about experiencing your product, which is a hard-hitting fact for brands, but sometimes people just generally have preferences for experiential stuff over what they ultimately get. I think pop-ups build up nicely to this takeaway.
Don't take what we say as a blanket statement, law of the land sort of thing. But if you think about it, or at least try to consider it from our perspective, if I have to choose between spending $7.50 on a drink to see my friend versus $7.50 on a bag of chips, $7.50 to see my friend sounds a lot more appealing because even though that drink will last me way less time, I get a weekend plan out of it. So if I'm feeling like I want to connect with my friend and I don't want to spend the full $15, I'm going to pick the option that gets me that fulfilling interaction versus the one that is like a snack treat. And you can apply it to many different types of products. Maybe I prefer to see a Broadway show instead of going shopping, or go to a concert instead of buying a new pair of shoes or splurging on a material item. Like Hebe said, there is a lot of movement towards experiences instead of just consuming material goods.
My positive psychology class would really like that because we've always emphasized in that class that material goods does not bring you lasting memories and happiness compared to experiences. So my professor would be really happy that you have that takeaway. And I think the broader idea here is consumers don't always need a product. Maybe your product just happens to be in that place where people can exist and own that conversation, that culture, and that experience. Maybe that's simply it. You're in the right place at the right time. And that place and time should be low barrier, low cost because we're broke, not performative, unless it's a joke, as you know from all the performative males of the world. I think a really good example right now is Starbucks, who recently reversed their sit down policy where you have to purchase a product and be able to hang out.
Which brings our episode to a close.
And so, thank you so much for tuning into another episode of Let's Circle Back. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn to keep up with the latest between releases.
Feel free to let me know if my mic sounded better this episode. I am constantly working to improve the quality of production. We have been your hosts. I'm Valentina.
And I'm not Timothy Chalamet, but Hebe.
And we'll see you next time.
Shut